Until all women are lesbians, there will be no true political revolution. Until all women are lesbians, there will be no true political revolution. What in the world am I talking about? Well, we continue our conversation about the separatist movements of the 1960s and 1970s, and we turn our attention now to women's liberation. If Archie Bunker had something to say about African Americans in the 1960s and 1970s, he certainly had a lot to say about the group he called Women's Libbers. And let's look at something that he had to say.
Why would you ever need a turbocharged engine and dual-clutch transmission? Do you really need a reason? Introducing the all-new Seltos.
Archie, the next step is to get them to pay me like a fella.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, they're putting me on regular next week, but they're paying me less than they paid the man who used to run the forklift.
Oh, well, come on, Irene. After all, it's a well-known fact. Men are worth more than women.
Archie, have you been reading Playboy?
No, Irene, the Bible.
Bible?
The Bible. And in the Bible it says, God made man in his own image. He made women after, from a rib. Cheaper cut.
Archie! I'm doing the same work as a man. And if he was getting paid $6 an hour, why should I get $5.50?
Because, Irene, you're getting what? You're getting $5.50 an hour?
Archie, that's exactly what they're paying you.
What they're paying me?
There goes your rib theory.
And there goes the whole country, meathead. When you see the data, they're giving women the same pay as men and giving women the same jobs. Where the hell is it all going to end? What are you going to say when a woman is managing the Mets?
I'll say we have equality, right? Right. Right, Michael?
Let's think about that a minute.
Yeah. And while you're thinking about it, think about this. Equality is unfair. That's right. What's the point of a man working hard all his life, trying to get someplace, if all he's going to do is wind up equal?
So the quotation I began with is from the 1973 book Lesbian Nation, where the author argues that women need to engage in a radical separation from men if they hope to achieve political equality. Well, look, it's one thing for African Americans in the Black Power movement to call for a kind of collective segregation, collective withdrawal from the mainstream for the goal of community empowerment, right? We can understand African Americans wanting to separate themselves and build up their own communities. How do women separate themselves from men? Nevertheless, if women don't separate themselves from men, if they continue to sleep with the enemy in terms of perpetuating patriarchal institutions like child rearing, marriage, how will women experience true liberation? And so the point here is to suggest that the women's liberation goals they're harder to imagine or grasp than, say, with the Black Power movement. It's hard to know what a liberated woman looked like. And so when we talk about women's liberation, in fact, we have to talk about women's liberations. There is no kind of one image of a liberated woman, but instead multiple images that are produced in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and where women's liberation or second wave feminism, as it's sometimes called, where this begins and where it ends are in some ways very different places. So as we go through and kind of chart the history of women's liberation, we're going to stop at different points and just kind of focus on what exactly the liberated woman looked like at that particular point in time or in that particular artifact. In many ways, second wave feminism or women's liberation is dated to the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. Friedan was a part of the Old Left. She was a journalist who wrote on labor causes. As the labor movement is becoming fairly passive and domesticated, in the 1950s she's looking for something new to write about. And she decides to write about the status, the contentment of women in the United States. In many ways, this begins with a survey that she sent to her old college classmates at Smith, and essentially asking them, are you happy? And what she finds is that they are not. So she decides to, as a journalist, kind of dig deeper into this. It's amazing that I've taught The Feminine Mystique now for over 20 years, and it was only last year I finally got around to actually reading the book for my honors class, and I was blown away by this book. What Friedan actually argues in there, and I didn't know this until I read it, is what she calls the feminine mystique, this idea that women find themselves through domestic labor, through being wives, through being mothers, and that this is in many ways the best that they can aspire for, what they all need to essentially aspire to. That this was not something that had run through the course of human history. Instead, in the United States, this was a product of the upheavals of the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. That this feminine mystique, when she went and looked at like advertisements in magazines and articles in magazines from the 20s and even into the 1930s, what she found is all kinds of images of women being called to a variety of different careers and educations. Yeah, hi Mo. Mo has something to say about all this. And that it's into the 40s and 50s that you begin to see more of this feminine mystique, this concerted push by American society to confine women to domestic labor as wives and as child rearers. And so she sees this feminine mystique, if you will, as really a cage, a box containing women's aspirations, and ultimately messing up not just an entire generation of women, but men too. She paints a picture of a completely dysfunctional society in the 1950s. One that is so repressed, one that is instead of finding finding a meaning in life through creative labor, through creative work, instead one that finds itself through illicit sexual behavior. What she uncovers really muckraking fashion about women and the way that they talked about their husbands and all the affairs, the sexual fantasies that she had. This generation of women were really messed up, and it's because they were in many ways enslaved by this feminine mystique that had developed in the late 30s, but in the 40s and 50s too. And she really called for a liberation from this cage of the feminine mystique. Understand the language of existentialism, as it was with the Port Huron statement, as it was with in some ways Carmichael. Carmichael liked to quote Sartre and Camus a lot. Friedan does the same thing. In many ways, the feminine mystique is an existentialist track, calling women to accept their freedom, to stop living in the bad faith that society, pastors, the government is saying women have to fulfill these particular roles. Instead, Friedan is saying embrace the freedom and the responsibility of that freedom that comes. This is a quotation from the feminine mystique, and you can kind of see the liberationist aspects of the feminine mystique of existentialism. Here, as women are told, look, nobody can tell you what your life is. You have to accept the freedom, and in many ways, the freedom of choice. Friedan does not in any way, at any point, denigrate women who want to be wives, want to be mothers, but she insists it should be their choice. They can only authentically be themselves, ultimately authentically embrace wifehood and motherhood if it is their choice. But they should also have the freedom to choose to not marry, to delay marriage, to have what Friedan again and again and again calls creative labor. More opportunities should be opened up for women. This book came along at a time in which more and more women were, despite all of the imagery of the father knows best, June Cleaver, Leave It to Beaver, images of women in the 1950s, and in many ways, those imagery are propaganda, because more and more women are working outside of the home in the 1950s than ever before, and yet they are, being forced through all of these different avenues, whether it's TV shows or magazines or government propaganda. Even psychological advice. Psychologists were there telling women who don't want to marry, or women who are single should not be allowed to teach children because they're obviously psychologically messed up. Women are working outside of the home in greater numbers, and so this kind of contradiction between what women are actually doing in the 50s and 60s. And what society is telling them they need to be. Friedan's book comes along and it exposes that gap, and it's a tremendous success. Its number. I mean, I think it eventually sells about 3 million copies, but I mean, almost the entire country is debating and engaging with this book. She received millions of letters from women and men all over the country, all over the world, ultimately, many of whom are saying thank you. Others, and a lot of them women, who are saying, why are you trying to deflate our status? Right? They found great status in being wives and mothers, and they felt like Friedan and feminists were trying to demean them. That was certainly never Friedan's situation. So the feminine mystique is kind of tapping this groundswell of dissatisfaction among women who are increasingly working outside of the home, but being told that they are psychologically deranged if they desire for something other than a domestic existence. On the success of the feminine mystique, the JFK's first presidential commission on the status of women, kind of documenting what are women actually doing, what are the prospects for women's place in American society going forward. The Civil Rights, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 didn't just extend to African Americans; it also extended to women through Title VII. Given all this momentum in the women's movement, momentum that it really hadn't had since, in many ways, World War I, you see a new organization formed, the National Organization of Women, or NOW. Women want equal rights, and they want those rights now. The language of NOW includes phrases like what women want are, quote, true equality and, quote, full participation in American life. They argue that women had been living under a, quote, separate but not equal status in America. And they believed American society needed to change given where women were actually at in society at that time. That included things like strengthening, and I mean, we did have equal pay laws coming out of World War II, but now wanted to strengthen enforcement of equal pay laws. Federal daycare centers, for making it easier for women to be able to work outside of the home without having to, give half of their income away towards childcare. This is particularly difficult for single women, but also for poorer families too, where both men and women had to work. This wasn't just a city thing. This wasn't just a rural thing. This was a suburban thing too. It cost a lot of money to keep up with the Joneses. It cost a lot of money to be the Cleavers. And so federal daycare centers revived the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. It had been around since the 1920s, but it had been just kind of there in limbo and never really made its way out of Congress. Now is saying now is the time to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have added an amendment to the U.S. Constitution saying that men and women shall have equal rights. Establishing a basis for other legislation is a U.S. constitutional amendment which would grant equality or define equality for women on the basis of men as well too. Now did not call for some kind of radical separation from men or even giving up on marriage. The language that now used was the language of partnership. Men and women needed to see themselves not as master and subordinate, but rather needed to see themselves as partners, and they needed to develop a new kind of partnership in marriage and figure this way out. And so, a liberated woman for now was, in some ways, a conservative vision of women having more economic opportunities, having more of a public life outside of the home, possibly even delaying marriage or not marrying. But it was not one that radically, as for instance the author of Lesbian Nation would do, radically question women's relationship with men. They thought that in traditional institutions of marriage and child rearing, women could still find that sense of authenticity. They could answer the "who am I" question that Friedan said that they desperately needed to answer. So now was a fairly conservative phase of women's liberation or second wave feminism. It would increase its membership by 50% in August of 1970. Now sponsored a Women's Strike for Equality Day. And so you can go on YouTube and search for Women's Strike for Equality. You'll see newspapers, television, covering different strikes that women engaged in on this day. And it really brought publicity to women's liberation. And a lot of women came into the movement in 1970, including a lot of younger women. And these younger women who come in push now in a more radical political direction. These younger women are coming in from a couple of different places. One I like to call kind of the Sex and the City wing. These are young, single, urban women who, just by the fact that they're single and they're living in cities, they are fairly liberated from the conventions of a June cleaver. But it's also a lot of women who are leaving the New Left, who are leaving Black Power, who are leaving the Civil Rights Movement, because they recognize the contradiction there between here they are fighting for equal rights for African Americans, fighting for fighting all these different causes. And women still felt themselves to be subordinate to men in these organizations, even laughed at by the male leadership in these organizations whenever they sought to assert their own voice. When King talked about Black Power as a psychological call to manhood, right? He and a lot of the Black Power leaders met manhood. When Tom Hayden talked about achieving authenticity for men, he meant men largely, and women's place in all of these radical liberal movements was on very shaky ground, and so a lot of these women broke with these organizations in the late 1960s. Ultimately joined an organization like NOW and made women's liberation their cause. It was these younger women who pushed NOW in a more radical direction, particularly in pushing for liberalization of abortion laws, This was something that had been happening in the 1960s anyways. Interestingly, in the 1960s, it was Republican states and Republican governors like Ronald Reagan's California that were liberalizing abortion laws. A lot of now members were actually pro-life members. They didn't believe, including Friedan, didn't believe in abortion. And it was the Democratic Party, and particularly Catholics in the Democratic Party, who were opponents of liberalizing abortion laws. But now, under pressure from these younger women coming in, will move in a more radical political direction, including the passage, or not the passage, but sorry, the Roe v. Wade case in 1973, which shot down the bans on abortions at the state level. But I understand that Roe v. Wade had been the force of American law had been moving in that direction, and it wasn't Democrats who were kind of bringing that about. It was Republicans. But you can read the book by Daniel Williams. I'm forgetting the title right now. I'll track it down for you. That talks about the history, this kind of strange history of the pro-life movement beginning in the Democratic Party, but ultimately ended up in the Republican Party. Now in women's liberationists would see some significant political successes during the 1970s, including, interestingly, finding an unlikely ally in Richard Nixon. We'll talk more about Nixon in the future, but Nixon would sign into law the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which can be understood as kind of an affirmative action for women. That principle of affirmative action had been developed for African Americans in the late 1960s. It's extended to women with the goal of opening up what many women saw as an institutionally sexist society. How do you do that apart from government action to prefer women educational opportunities, but economic opportunities as well too? Part of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act was Title IX, and that's something that SAU students, given particularly how many female athletes we have, you should be aware that Title IX came along at a time in 1972 when colleges supported men's sports but did not think that they needed to provide equivalent opportunities for female athletics. Title IX changes that and provides protections, affirmations, if you will, even for female sports. So this is still, Title IX is still a significant piece of legislation today fighting against discrimination along a variety of lines. It's in the early 1970s that Congress passes the ERA. The president signs off on it and begins going then to the state level, right? A constitutional amendment has to be ratified at the state level by 3/4 of the states, and very quickly the ERA is passing. At the state level, it looked by 1975 like the ERA was going to be added to the U.S. Constitution. And let me ask you, constitutional scholars, do we have an ERA in the U.S. Constitution today? And you're all saying no, because you know your Constitution very well. We'll talk in future lectures about why we don't have an ERA, given how much support there was in the early 1970s for this and how quickly it was moving at the state level. Of course, Roe v. Wade in 1973, a decision that nobody was really satisfied with. Obviously, those who wanted to keep restrictions, keep up the state bans on abortion, were upset with this decision. But abortion advocates were upset too, because Roe v. Wade affirmed the right of states to continue to regulate this practice. And that has been in many ways where the pro-life movement has fought it out over the past 30, 40 years or so, is trying to fight it at the state level. And so nobody was really satisfied with Roe v. Wade. Politically speaking, it's in 1977, the National Women's Conference at Dallas. In that year, after Gerald Ford had made 1975 International Women's Year, this women's liberation stemming from the United States was, in many ways, a global cause. The National Women's Conference at Dallas in 1977 is kind of like the women's liberation equivalent of the March on Washington in 1963. It was kind of the high point of unity for this movement, where it seemed like significant political gains were being brought about by women who were, despite all the divisions that were revealed in the National Women's Conference, among kind of the way forward, what way should they go. Nevertheless, they were found enough unity in this time to see some significant legislative success. What a lot of people didn't know at the time is that the 77 was in many ways the high point of the political expression of women's liberation. After 1977, women's liberationists would find themselves a lot more frustrated in particularly advancing their political causes. But we'll talk more about that in future lectures. Now, before I leave you with the impression that women's liberation was purely a political phenomenon, we need to talk about all the cultural changes that were going on at this time. One expression of this was the 1968 Miss America pageant protest. Understand that women's liberationists didn't just work through the political system. They understand that, as Friedan had suggested, that American culture, American values needed to change too. Institutional sexism needed to be identified and rooted out. One of the expressions of institutional sexism that women's liberationists identified was the Miss America pageant. You can see there how these women in Atlantic City, New Jersey, are kind of mocking in many ways this beauty pageant institution as treating women kind of like cattle to be auctioned off. Just really dehumanizing women in many ways. And you see protesters there trying to, let's judge ourselves as people, trying to affirm the humanity of women as opposed to the feminine mystique, which saw women largely only in terms of their biological and particularly their sexual capacities as wives and mothers, and ignored everything else that the women could contribute to society. Miss America pageant protest significant for a number of reasons. These protests generated national news, and so a lot of Americans first learned the phrase women's liberation in 1968 from these women. Some of our mythology of women's liberation comes out of this event. If the symbol of black power was the raised fist, the symbol of the liberated woman is the burned bra. And, of course, historians they always want to know, when did this begin? And so inevitably people want to know, well, who burned the first bra? When did this happen? And for a long time, people thought, well, this happened at Miss America, the Miss America pageant protest. Protesters had a freedom trash can that they set up, in which all kinds of tools of male oppression, girdles and makeup and just bras were put in this can with the intent of being burned. But no bras were burned on that day. The protesters did not get a permit, so they ultimately did not burn anything in the freedom trash can. So who burned the first bra? We don't know. But we know it did not happen in 1968 on this particular day. Nevertheless, a lot of people continue to still think that these radical feminists protesting Miss America pageant burned the first bra. And it is true, this group was more radical than, say, the Friedan feminists. For one, these protesters would not allow men to be involved in this protest. So they separated themselves. I mean, a lot of men who supported women's liberation wanted to be a part of that. These women at least said no. These women would, when it came time for them to be arrested, ultimately they would only be arrested by female police. Yes, there were female policemen at this time, police women, but they were not allowed to arrest anyone. So, go figure that one. They would go quietly as long as they were arrested by by police women. And they would only talk to female journalists as well, too. So the Miss America pageant gives us a more radical version of the liberated woman, the woman who does want to does want to kind of organize their own protests, find themselves independent of men, but also more radical in the sense of identifying a sexist culture, which they believe ultimately leads to a sexist politics. And so if you need America's, if you want America's political system to change in favor of female equality, then you need to change American culture, and vice versa. The idea of cultural politics, that there's an intimate linkage between changing culture and changing the political landscape. These two things have to go together, is one of the legacies of the Miss America pageant, or as women's liberation would say, the personal is political. As women throw off the feminine mystique at an individual level, that is ultimately a political act, particularly when they can do it en masse through protests like the Miss America pageant. Now, the bridge between these isolated incidents and a more general cultural awakening would come through Gloria Steinem's magazine, Miss. Steinem had been a part of the New Left. She was an anti-war journalist. Her editor asked her to cover this women's liberationist group on a college campus. I forget exactly where the campus was. In a way that Bible studies might spontaneously pop up at a place like Spring Arbor. On college campuses in the mid to late 60s, you see these, they were called consciousness-raising groups, as women got together to talk about all the different ways in which culture was oriented towards venerating men, liberating men, and holding women back, and all the different things that they needed to be able to take control over their own lives, not just political but cultural changes as well too. Steinem was not really aware of any of this until she went to report on this particular group, and she describes it as almost kind of a religious transformation. She is able to help identify the sexism of the New Left and the anti-war movement, and ultimately wants to take these kind of consciousness-raising conversations that are happening at these behind closed doors in college campuses. How do we bring this out to a more general audience? Well, she's a journalist, and so, all right, let's start a new magazine, a newspaper. And so in goodness gracious, just a historian who can't remember dates. I'm getting there, I promise. December of 1971, Miss Magazine will be launched. Now, Miss will never have a circulation much beyond 30,000. It's a pretty small circulation compared to some other magazines we'll talk about in the future. But still, a magazine doesn't have to, just like for Dan's book, just because a smaller circulation doesn't mean people aren't talking about these things. By the way, Miss, MS period, does that refer to a married woman or a single woman? So confused growing up because I never knew whether to call a lady, an older lady, Miss or Mrs. Do I use the MISS or MRS? What helped me was teaching at Christian colleges, because I learned that the joke is the female students are here to get their MRS degree. And I say that that's a joke and that's a myth, right? But I don't know. Maybe you still find that in some of your circles or in your cases that women are at Spring Arbor to get their MRS degree. MS period is neither. MS is the version of Mr., right? We don't, for instance, when a Mr. John gets married, we don't change him to Misters or something like that. It's just Mr., whether the person is single or married. And what women's liberation is saying, let's stop judging a woman based on whether she's single or whether she's married. It's just MS period. So MS period is the generic for all women, irregardless of their status as single or married. Miss Magazine looked to promote female equality. You can understand Miss Magazine in many ways as kind of muckraking for the women's movement, trying to take what Friedan had called the problem that has no name. Miss Magazine was trying to put a name on it, trying to identify these things, these problems that were going on at the time, and bring them out so we could have an actual conversation. Women Tell the Truth About Their Abortions, an 1972 article that talked about all these women who in the 1950s and 1960s, all these girls who had gotten pregnant and had gone to underground abortion networks, many of them run by pastors and priests, but conducted by doctors who had no business doing anything medical. A lot of these, now obviously the women who found themselves killed, they did not testify, they were dead, but the women who found themselves mutilated, scarred, did tell the truth about their abortions, trying to highlight why we needed to legalize abortion so that we could regulate it and make it a safe practice. Welfare is a women's issue. This magazine, like a lot of women's liberationists, pushed nationalized health care because ultimately, absent a national health care policy, the burden of caring for the elderly falls upon women, because after all, the idea of the feminine mystique is that women are uniquely gifted by God to be the caregivers, and so the women, it's not enough for them to take care of their husbands and their children and to work on the side. They also have to take care of their parents and ultimately their husbands' parents. Miss Magazine is trying to bring all these things up. I forgot to mention a personal story when I talk about these consciousness raising groups. My own mother. My mother was a teenager in the 50s and 60s. My mom was and is incredibly bright. She always got good grades in school, but she had terrible test anxiety, particularly math tests. So my grandparents took her to the doctor, about this, and ultimately he said, "Don't send her to college." It's my mom. Don't send her to college because she's not going to be able to handle the work. And that was a common understanding for women. Many women did go to college in the 50s and 60s, but other women got advice like my mother, which is you can't handle the pressure of college, so don't go to college. And so my mother didn't go to college. She went to cosmetology school and has struggled for a lot of her life to have a decent income. It finds herself even in her late 60s now having to continue to work, whereas she just would have done amazingly in college. But the idea that women cannot handle things like math, cannot handle the pressures of college was something that was typical during these times. These consciousness-raising groups were trying to, dispel these notions that somehow women were intellectually inferior to men. People like Gloria Steinem and Miss Magazine are trying to kind of, dispel those, bring these myths up, talk about where they're coming from, and shoot them down. The Truth About Battered Wives, a magazine issue that featured women, a woman who with a bruised face on its cover, trying to highlight the problem of domestic abuse. Right? It's not like women weren't beaten by their husbands before this time. It's just that they were told that, in many cases by their mothers, they were told that they needed to internalize that abuse. Your husband beat you? Well, you shouldn't have burned the pot roast. You should have been quicker to bring him a beer when he got home from work. If you are beaten by your husband, it is your fault. That was a common understanding of the 1950s and 1960s. Wives, if you suffered domestic abuse, you must not be a very good wife. Miss Magazine is fighting against this myth about spousal abuse. This issue sparks a national conversation, and I'd like to think that we are at a better place on the issue of domestic abuse. Certainly, I think women are less likely to internalize, although that, of course, still happens. Understand, where did American society begin to change? When did some of these sexist myths begin to be challenged and confronted? It's in the late 60s, it's in the 1970s. It's people like Gloria Steinem and Miss Magazine who are trying to bring these issues to light, to get people to talk about these issues, to understand how widespread they are, and to see how we can make changes. A lot of feminists loved, if you might imagine, loved Miss Magazine, but others had, others were critical in some ways. They wrote letters to Steinem and say, hey, love your magazine, but I can't help but notice that when you run advertisements, they're featuring women in stereotypical roles. They're featuring women in, makeup and fashion and all these things that we are trying to free women of these stereotypes. You seem to be, kind of sending a contradictory message. On the one hand, you're running these great articles on the left-hand side of the page, and the right side of the page you're featuring women in all these traditional domestic roles and teaching women to highlight their femininity and sexuality, ultimately for the benefit of men. And so even here, with the more radical feminism of Gloria Steinem and Miss Magazine, even here there's conflicts on what exactly a liberated woman should look like. In many ways, these advertisements running even in magazines like Miss Magazine highlight the emergence of another kind of women's liberation and another kinds of feminism during these years. What we might call the image of the supermom, if you will. And here's a snippet of an essay called The New Superwoman. See if any of this describes your mother. It's from 1980. The all-around supermom rises, dresses in her vivid pantsuit, oversees breakfast and the search for the sneakers, and then goes off to her glamorous, high-paying job in an advertising agency where she seeks personal fulfillment in the kids' college tuition. She has, of course, previously found a Mary Poppins figure to take care of the kids after school. Mary Poppins loves them as if they were her own, works for a mere pittance, and is utterly reliable. Supermom 2 comes home from work at 5:30 just as fresh as a daisy, and then spends a truly creative hour with her children. After all, it's not the quantity of the time, but the quality. She catches up on their day, soothes their disputes, and helps them with their homework while creating something imaginative in her Cuisinart, with her left hand tied behind her back. After dinner, during which she teaches them about the checks and balances of our system of government, she bathes and reads to them and puts the clothes in the dryer. She then turns to her husband and eagerly suggests that they explore some vaguely kinky sexual fantasy. Any of you have the supermom, the woman whose understanding of liberation, or at least is trying to live out the idea of a liberated woman who has a full-time job outside of the home, but nevertheless is still expected to fulfill her traditional roles as a wife and as a mother. This is in many ways where women's liberation begins in 1963 with Friedan's vision of a woman achieving kind of self-direction, authenticity, having the freedom to choose. And in some ways, women's liberation ends up in a completely different cage, the cage of the supermom, a woman who supposedly is liberated, but seems to, in this case, liberation just seems to be adding on. It's like, yes, women, you can work outside of the home, you can be the CEOs of company, you can become professionals, you can go to college, but you still have to do all your domestic chores, you still have to be the primary child rearers, and you still have to take care of your husbands. All kinds of images of the supermom are arising during this time, including by one evangelical author in 1973 who wrote, Maribel Morgan, in 1973 wrote a book called The Total Woman. You can I'll let you kind of look at this on your own. The total woman was the woman who does have a life outside of her home, but still, nevertheless, finds her ultimate identity in still being the housewife, in still being the mother, while still having this life outside of the home as too. And this evangelical author is suggesting that you can be the total, complete, you can do all of these things. Or a 1982 book, you can have it all. It's not just print books that push the idea of the supermom. It was, a lot of it was advertisers. A lot of it was Madison Avenue. Just one example of this: the Anjali I'm a Woman campaign of the 1960s.
I can put the wash on the line, feed the kids, get dressed, pass out the kisses, and get to work by 5 and 9. 'Cause I'm a woman, Anjali.
Give her Anjali, the 8-hour perfume for that 24-hour woman.
I can bring home the bacon, Anjali. Fry it up in a pan, Anjali. And never, never, never let you forget you're a man. 'Cause I'm a woman.
Anjali, the 8-hour perfume for your 24-hour woman.
The 24-hour woman. I don't know that this is exactly what Betty Friedan was expecting when she published The Feminine Mystique, but in many ways this is where feminism ends up. The expectation that, yes, women, you can work outside of the home, you can have a big salary, you can achieve fame and fortune, but you still have to fulfill all these domestic roles as well, too. Now, that's from the 1980s. You wouldn't think in our own day that Madison Avenue could get could get away with sending out that kind of image of the 24-hour woman. You wouldn't think they'd get away with it, but leave it to good old Kelly Ripa.
Thank you so much. How do I entertain a packed house? With my new Electrolux appliances. Now I can cook the roast for the dinner party and the mac and cheese for the sleepover. Simmer the chocolate sauce, toss Jack's toy, serve the gummy bears, then the apple juice at the perfect temperature, be the charming co-host, clean the stemware perfectly, and end the night looking for monsters under the bed. Introducing Electrolux with wave touch controls and an induction hybrid cooktop that boils water in 90 seconds. You can be even more amazing.
So you can be even more amazing. Look, Kelly Ripa's evil. All right, it's not just that.
I'm Hildy Lisco. I'm a reporter.
Sorry.
You sent this to the whole school? I'm a journalist.
Hildy is an unusual case. Every parent thinks their child is
Sorry about that. Kelly Ripa is evil. Let me get back to it. She is evil. It's not just... Come on. It's not just the fact that we're supposed to believe that Kelly Ripa just runs around doing all this stuff herself. She doesn't have people who take care of the kids, doesn't have people who do the cooking for her, the cleaning for her. It's crazy. The other thing, and watch this commercial, is like, where's your husband? Like, does the guy have absolutely no role in all of this? No, it's this strange message of female empowerment. So you can be even more amazing if you have these labor-saving devices, but it's putting a burden upon women, particularly women with husbands with children, that how could that possibly be liberating? It seems in many ways a new form of enslavement. Well, I'll let you evaluate that and how much the supermom imagery is still around today. It does seem that women's liberation begins in one place and ends up in a very different kind of place. But what I wanted you to primarily see is that, there is no one version of a liberated woman. There were multiple different versions expressed during the years, just like there are today. So kind of in conclusion, let's talk a little bit about the legacy of women's liberation. I think you can sum up the legacy of women's liberation, the positive legacy, in one word, and that word is choice. Because, and this isn't the case with all women, and some of you might be even listening now, you might feel you haven't had a lot of choices in your life, or you might even feel pressured that the choice to delay marriage, the choice to not marry, the choice of your career is something that has been determined for you by someone else. Nevertheless, it does seem that we are at a different place today than we were, say, in the 1950s and even 1960s in terms of a belief that women should have choice, and if they want to be mothers and wives, that they should have the freedom to do that, but they should also have the freedom to not do that. They should have the freedom to go to college and even to aspire to be, I don't know, like President of the United States even. Can you imagine a woman President of the United States? Getting harder and harder to imagine a woman ever becoming President of the United States, but we'll see what the future holds. On the other side, women's liberation does reflect another kind of identity politics. It does reflect another kind of division or disunity in American life. And in some ways, this goes back to the issue of choice, too. Right? In the 1950s, the assumption was, okay, the man's going to get the job and the man's going to go out and work, and the woman's going to stay at home, or if she does work, it's going to be kind of supplemental labor in the evening after dad gets home or whatever. As oppressive as that maybe was, as limiting as that was for women, there was a kind of order to it in which everybody kind of knew what to do. What exactly should a marriage and child rearing and how that intersects with careers, how does all that work out today? It seems like a lot of things need to be settled. Can the man be the primary child rearer and the woman be have the major income, or how do they work these questions out? There's a lot more things that need to be settled because of the problem of choice with freedom. Freedom always brings choice, and choice, as much as choice can be a liberation, it can also be a new source of anxiety. And so we are a more anxious, a more stressed out, a more divided culture in many ways because of the radical liberal movements of the 1960s and 1970s. But if the only way for African Americans and women, other minorities, to achieve equal rights, to achieve authenticity, to achieve a chance at self-direction in America, if the only way that these things can be brought about is through having to live with significant division and conflict in our society, then maybe it's okay we're not all in the family anymore. Maybe we're just going to have to learn and work through our divisions and conflicts. The mark of a healthy society, like the mark of a healthy marriage, is not the absence of conflict. The absence of conflict usually means some kind of oppression, right? You have societies that don't have a lot of conflict in them today, like, say, North Korea. Anyone want to go live in North Korea? No. Free societies inevitably generate conflict. And if the only way for women, racial and ethnic minorities, is to achieve equal rights, equal opportunities, is through identity politics, is through promoting divisions and the separations of Americans, then maybe it's okay we're not all in the family and we're going to have to work through our conflicts. We've been fighting a culture war since the 1970s and 1980s. All odds are we're going to continue to fight a culture war well into your lifetime. But if this is the only way that we can work out, this is the only way we can overcome the racial and gender oppressions of the past and get to a more equal and just society, achieve a genuinely participatory democracy, as Port Huron called it, then maybe it's okay we're not all in a family, and we're just going to have to learn to live with conflict for the foreseeable future. Thank you.